few years ago, social scientist Stephen Lewandowski and his colleague John Cook noticed that climate scientists and vaccine researchers were both having problems effectively communicating with the public. They noticed that these scientists, they were committing the same mistakes that people in the media often commit when attempting to address misinformation and myths and, well, outright lies. Specifically, they were causing the backfire effect. They were doing more harm than good, and they were doing this left and right. In response to this problem, Lewandowski and Cook wrote the Debunking Handbook. It's an attempt to take what we've learned in psychology and political science for decades now and hand that knowledge over to, and I'm making quotation marks, my fingers in the air, the quote-unquote hard sciences. And I'm doing that because, well, as the backfire effect demonstrates, physics may subsume all the other sciences, that's true, including psychology, but psychology subsumes physicists. The Debunking Handbook begins by asking scientists to abandon something called the Information Deficit Model.
Well, the information deficit model basically means that, if people have difficulty accepting a scientific proposition, that's because they just don't know enough.
I love that. As you may have noticed, we were having some issues with Stephen's microphone, so I'll be doing a lot of paraphrasing during all of this, so please forgive his audio quality. But yes, the information deficit model is this idea that people simply don't have all the facts yet, or at least not enough of them, and you do. And so this is why people who are wrong maintain a false belief or accept as fact a piece of misinformation. Moon landing deniers, 9/11 truthers, Obama birthers, vaccine deniers, Pizzagate conspiracy theorists, climate change deniers, people who believe in homeopathy and cleanses and that there's still a operating secret Nazi space station or that you can live on air alone. And those last two are real, by the way. The air thing, it's called breatharianism. Anyway, the idea is that if you just dump a bunch of facts at the feet of these people who have these misconceptions or have faulty information or who just believe things that aren't true, these facts will just sort of break a wrongness spell.
If only you gave them more information, then they would see the light and bingo, everybody is happy.
The mistake here, Lewandowski says, is it's not what people think that matters, but how they think. It's not that they don't know, it's they refuse to know. The information that you're presenting is terrifying or challenging to who they are, to what they think they are, to their world view. And that is one of several different variations of the backfire effect that he identifies in the Debunking Handbook. This one is called the Worldview backfire effect.
So if you don't believe the Earth is round, then the information deficit model says, well, that's because you just don't know what the evidence is. And let me now, tell you why the Earth is round. And then you're supposed to update your beliefs and say, now I know, and switch to this more accurate representation of the world.
Lewandowski says that this sort of updating of existing models and replacing them when better ones come along is, of course, vital for a functioning democracy, and it's the essential business of science itself. But individuals always resist this, and as David Redlosk explained in the previous segment with his virtual presidential primary, that resistance has a breaking point. But before you reach it, challenges often backfire.
And in many circumstances, in many situations, the information deficit model just fails completely.
If you recall, this was the topic in our second episode in this series. Once information has become interwoven with a person's personal identity, cultural identity, or fundamental worldview, threatening that information raises alarms about the decoherence of the entire model of reality they use to make sense of everything. Even if it's not their entire model of reality, it could be some small model, and they have a commitment, a motivation to not believe you, to protect it. Or as Steinbeck wrote, sometimes a man wants to be stupid. If it lets him do a thing, his cleverness forbids.
Now, the easiest example, I guess, is that of smoking. If you're a chain smoker and you're addicted to nicotine, well, you really don't want to hear that this is going to kill you. So it is understandable if somebody says, oh, whoa, yeah, the doctors are saying this, but actually, they're saying it because they want to make money and the federal government is paying them to do this, and it's all hippies or socialists or regulations or whatever.
Lewandowski has several pieces of advice for dealing with the worldview backfire effect. First of all, he says, if you can, avoid arguing with people on the fringes. Those are the people for whom maintaining a misperception might be so fundamental to their core beliefs that you're guaranteed a long and difficult battle. And that's not to say it's impossible to reach them. It's just that that same effort could instead be directed toward the undecided, toward the persuadable, who in many issues make up a larger portion of the population. Changing their minds will push the fringes into an even narrower slot in the distribution of ideas, making the influence of the fringes less of a concern on issues facing large groups. But here's the thing. As the Leadership Lab's field organizer, Steve DeLine, told me in our episode about deep canvassing, even among the persuadable, you must treat each conversation as an attempt for you and the other person to solve a mystery together, and not as an attempt to change the other person's mind.
If you walk up to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to change your mind, guess what? They're going to say, whoa, hang on, no way. But if you walk up to people and effectively say the opposite, you say, look, I don't want to change your mind. I don't care what you think. I think what you're thinking is just great. However, here's a couple of other things you might want to consider. Well, that's a completely different approach. That makes people more susceptible to listening to you.
If you do happen to find yourself dealing with someone who is deeply entrenched, Stephen says reframing the message is key. Research shows that using words like carbon offset instead of carbon tax greatly improves the chances of a successful persuasion attempt. You may have noticed that people on both sides employ this tactic already, using phrases like death tax or death panels, words already charged with emotional associations that can be used to encourage the backfire effect as much as they can be used to avoid it. And his third piece of advice is to do what groups like the Nudge Unit do in the UK, which is to not worry about people's worldview or belief at all. Just focus on people's behaviors instead. The research is clear that belief often follows behavior. For instance, if you want people to wash their hands a certain number of times a day while working in a restaurant, factory, or hospital, instead of spending time on training courses that are largely ineffective, the Nudge Unit recommends that employees just get a stamp at the beginning of the day on top of their hands made with a special vegetable dye that will scrub off after a certain number of washings. The places where this has been implemented in the real world not only see a massive initial increase in hand washing, but over time, the behavior becomes routine and normal, and it establishes a new belief in the importance of this practice. Many of our beliefs about what is normal and what is taboo follow from this kind of invisible behavioral modification.
You don't have to convince people that smoking is dangerous. You just got to change their behavior by making it harder to smoke in public, for example.
Stephen's fourth piece of advice concerning the worldview backfire effect is to try to seek self-affirmation. As strange as this sounds, research suggests that if you ask people to consider how they have acted on their values in the past in a way that makes them feel really great about themselves, they're much less likely to reject challenges to their beliefs than people who don't get a chance to think these nice, positive thoughts about themselves beforehand.
So, for example, if you take somebody who's a supporter of the free market, you can get them to relate an experience when they felt really great about these values. And then maybe they will say something like, well, I was an entrepreneur when I was 22, and, I bought my first Mercedes when I was 23, and wow, that was really cool. And then you say, right, brilliant. Now, how about climate change? And if you do this right, then you can show in the laboratory that affirming people's fundamental beliefs makes them more able to process information that's challenging to those beliefs. So they feel good about who they are. And then you say, well, yeah, sure, you can be, in favor of the free market, but that doesn't mean you can't buy a solar panel or whatever. And or that doesn't mean that there isn't climate change and that we have to deal with it, etc., etc.
Now, this is not well understood. We don't know how this really works, but it seems to be a way to psychologically move the threat to identity off the table.